Radio League Unlimited and A View from the Hill presents Rugby League, That's the Way It Was. A new podcast that unpacks history-making moments in rugby league and explains their significance on the game then and now. Featuring all the players both on and off the field. This episode, the 1970 Ashes Tour of Australia. Here's your host, Robert Cora.
Hello and welcome to That's the Way It Was, a program that looks back at the history of rugby league. And for this, our first episode, well, with the Ashes cricket series on at the moment, we thought we'd take a look back at one of rugby league's great Ashes series. And it took place back in 1970. And to do this, we're going to speak to Alan Whiticker, historian and author of many rugby league books. Alan, welcome to the show.
G'day, boys. Nice to talk to you.
Okay, Alan, before we speak about the 1970 series, who actually held rugby league's Ashes prior to this tour getting underway?
Well, Australia had won the Ashes on the 1963-64 Kangaroo Tour, that very famous tour where they reclaimed the Ashes in England after, I think, 50 years. They'd never beaten England in England. And we'd managed to hang on to them in the 66 Ashes series, which was played here. And then again, very narrowly, a narrow victory in 1967-68. So we were the holders, and there was a lot of expectation that we would hold on to them.
Okay, now I'll read out the British Lions squad of 1970, and Alan, I'll ask you to comment on some of these players. The coach was Johnny Whiteley. The captain was Frank Myler from St Helens. There were a lot of players from Castleford. Castleford were a very strong club at this time in England. They'd won the Challenge Cup in 1969 and 1970. So from Castleford we had Derek Edwards, the two halves, Alan Hardesty and Keith Hepworth, Dennis Hartley, a 16-stone front rower was there, Malcolm Reilly, the lock forward. There were also a lot of players from Leeds. Leeds had won the championship final in 1969 when they actually beat Castleford by 16-14, and they were runners-up to St Helens in 1970. So from Leeds, we had the two wingers, Alan Smith and John Atkinson, Sid Hines, Mike Shoebottom, and Barry Seaborn. We also had Roger Millward from Hull Kingston Rovers, Terry Price from Bradford Northern, Ray Dutton from Widnes, Cliff Watson from St Helens, Peter Flanagan, the hooker from Hull KR, was on his third visit to Australia, Tony Fisher from Bradford Northern, Doug Lawton from Wigan, Dave Robertson also from Wigan, Bob Irvine from Oldham, Jimmy Thompson from Featherstone Rovers, two players from Salford, John Ward and the centre Chris Hesketh, a very young second rower from Hull KR called Phil Lowe, and the Welshman Clive Sullivan from Hull, and Dave Chisnell, a prop from Lee, who was a late replacement for Jim Mills, who of course had signed to play with North Sydney. Now, firstly, Alan, what can you tell us about a coach, Johnny Whiteley?
Well, Whiteley was a member of the 1958 Lions tour that came out here. That's the famous broken arm tour. The captain broke his arm in the second test and turned the tide of the Ashes series in Brisbane, and the Lions won that match. So Whiteley was very experienced and made sure that his players knew what was ahead of them coming to Australia.
And the captain, Frank Myler? Well,
he was very experienced. He'd played Test football since 1960 in the 1960 World Cup competition. So he had, a full 10 years. So he was a very experienced player, very wily captain, wasn't into the rough stuff. He was a very pretty player, if you put it that way. He was a really classy centre, and he led the players very well on this tour.
Now, Alan, there were a whole heap of characters in this squad who went on to bigger and better things. Are there any that you specifically wanted to tell us about?
Well, I imagine the most experienced forward of the trip was Cliff Watson, the St Helens prop. And he played all three tests, and he missed the second. Oh, no, he's in the second test. He was then snatched up by Tommy Bishop, who was playing playing with Cronulla. And, of course, Bishop and Watson had that great combination with the Sharks there in the early 70s. But the standout players, as far as Australian audiences were concerned, were Malcolm Reilly, the ball-playing lock forward from Castleford, and Roger Millward. Roger Millward was a real revelation in that series.
Mm-hmm.
Tommy Bishop, of course, was here, doing wonderful things with the Sharks. So it wasn't expected that another great halfback would just jump out of the crowd. But Millward was really the man of the series. Millward pretty much won the second test single-handedly and scored the winning try in the third test. So Millward was a name that really resonated with Australian audiences. He was a great player.
All right, Alan, now before the first test, there are a number of warm-up matches. I think we need to point out that in these days, the teams didn't just play the test matches and go home. There were a lot of matches played before the first test and also between the test matches. Where had they been before the first test in Brisbane?
Well, the first test was in Brisbane, as you say,
yeah.
And they'd started their tour in Darwin, of all places.
Yes.
They stopped off there first, and then they came down the coast of Queensland, and they played a lot of soft sides, Wide Bay and North Queensland and Townsville, and they were pretty much underdone. They weren't really fit by the time they came through to the first test. They hadn't had a hard hit out, and Australia, the Australian team in the first test, really hit them with everything.
Yeah, well, probably the most important warm-up match, was that match against Queensland, which the British Lions won quite easily. They won by 32 to 7. Okay, now the first test, June the 6th at Lang Park. I'll just read out these two teams. The British Lions, the fullback was Terry Price. The wingers were Clive Sullivan and John Atkinson. Frank Myler and Mike Shoebottom were the centres. The Castleford pair, Hardesty and Hepworth, were the halves. Malcolm Reilly, the lock. The two Wigan players, Robertson and Doug Lawton, were in the second row. And the front row was Chisnell, Flanagan and Cliff Watson. The Australian team, coached by Arthur Summons, fullback and captain was Graeme Langlands. The wingers were Johnny King and Father John Coots. Centres were John McDonald and John Brass. The halves were the St George pair of Phil Hawthorne and Billy Smith. Ron Coote was the lock. In the second row was Arthur Beetson and Ron Lynch from Parramatta. The front row was John Wittenberg from St George and Jim Morgan from East, and Elwyn Walters was the hooker. Now, Alan, we should point out, I just wanted to point out that there also was some bench players. This was the first test series where players were allowed as replacement at any time during the actual match. So the Queenslander Cole Weiss was on the bench for Australia and Bob Irving was the reserve for the Lions. But Alan, I also wanted to point out in the Australian team, Father John Coots. So I think our listeners need to understand that a practicing priest did actually represent Australia at rugby league.
Well, he was a Newcastle player, and Newcastle at that time had a wonderfully tough competition.
Mm-hmm.
So while he was a priest in the Newcastle district, he played local football, and then he represented New South Wales country and Australia. And he had been a huge success on the 1969 tour of New Zealand, and being played in Queensland the first time for the first test, no Queenslanders were chosen side, only on the bench. So I think it was important that some of these country players also got picked. So he was carrying the banner for New South Wales country, and he thoroughly earned his place.
You're listening to Radio League Unlimited.
All right, now this first test match itself, Alan, this became quite a famous test match, the first test match of this series.
Well, I remember it very well. It was shown live on TV down here in Sydney, being played in Queensland, of course. And I remember my cousins, my older cousins, and my father, my grandfather, we all sat around the black and white TV, and it just unfolded. And it was mayhem pretty much from the beginning.
Yes.
Australia had the fitness. They had, I think, a better team. They had better goal kickers. Graeme Langlands was kicking them from everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
Phil Hawthorne was kicking field goals. Billy Smith was kicking field goals. And I think England got flustered because they turned on the rough stuff. And,
yes.
Yes, quite a few famous incidents came out of this game.
Well, yeah, Jim Morgan's nose was smashed by Eric Chisnell headbutt there. Ron Litch had his cheekbone fractured. Graeme Langlands himself had to have x-rays on his jaw after the match, but Australia led by 13-5 at half-time, and they won the match quite convincingly in the end, 37-15.
Yeah, mainly from penalty goals.
Mm-hmm.
Don Lancashire was the referee. Now, Don Lancashire was the leading referee in Brisbane, but he'd come down to Sydney that year, and he was the accepted pick above the very controversial Keith Page.
Mm-hmm.
He penalised the daylights out of England, and he wasn't adverse to awarding penalties right in front of the post. So that's why there was so many kicks at goal and so many goals were scored. But it was a bit of a false summer for Australia. We did it pretty easily, even with those injured players.
Yep.
We won the fight and we won the match. And I think that was probably the worst preparation that we could have had for the remainder of the series. And secondly, I think it was the wake-up call that Great Britain needed, that they were underdone, that those soft games that they played in the north of Queensland while they were effectively on holiday hadn't really prepared them for Test football. But they toughened up once they came down to Sydney.
Yeah. Well, okay, so Australia go one up in the series in front of 42,757 people. Now, before the second test, there were more warm-up matches, including a match on the day after the test, quite incredibly. They went down and played a match in Toowoomba the day after the test. Probably the most important warm-up game, as you said there, is against New South Wales, which ends in a 17-all draw. Now, the second test, June the 20th at the Sydney Cricket Ground, both teams make a lot of changes. The British line...
Well, I remember that New South Wales match very well because...
Yep.
It was really expected that New South Wales would win that match. It was almost a test-level New South Wales tie. And the fact that it ended in a 17-all draw and that England had fought back, they were down 15-2 in that match.
Mm-hmm.
That was the turning tide in the series. I think they realised that the strong forward game and then get the ball out amongst their backs. And the inclusion of Roger Millward, who didn't play in the first test, the inclusion of Roger Millward in that second test, I think was a crucial ploy by the Englishman.
All right, yes. So, as you said there, the British Lions do make a lot of changes, probably form-related for the second test, but Australia are forced to make a lot of changes because of injury. The British Lions, Terry Price is gone from fullback. Apparently he's too slow, and he was blamed for a couple of Australia's tries in that first test. So Derek Edwards is the fullback. The Leeds pair, Smith and Atkinson, are on the wings. Sid Hines comes into the centres with Frank Myler. Keith Hepworth is the half, and Roger Millward, as you said, is the 5'8". Malcolm Reilly at lock, Lawton and Thompson in the second row. Cliff Watson is one prop, and he's joined by the 16-stone motor mechanic from Castleford, Dennis Hartley, and the Welshman, Tony Fisher, is the new hooker. Now, for Australia, Ray Laird from Queensland is the fullback. King and the father are on the wings. Brass and McDonald are the centres. Smith and Hawthorn halves. Now, both Ron Lynch and Jim Morgan are injured. So Colweese, the Queenslander who was on the bench for the first test, he's the new lock forward. Ron Coote moves into the second row with Beetson. John Wittenberg is one front row, and he's joined by John Sattler from Souths, who is also made the captain. And Brian Fitzsimmons from Queensland replaces Elwyn Walters at hooker. We should also mention, I suppose, that Robert Fulton from Manly Warringah is named on the bench for Australia. Now, Alan, I think we need to point out to the listeners that these players, they would often back up for their club sides after playing in these test matches. I mean, after the first test, many of the players backed up and played for their club teams on the Sunday. Now, as you said earlier there, New South Wales played Great Britain on the Saturday following the first test, and Graeme Langlands captained that New South Wales team. But on the Monday, which was a public holiday actually, Langlands played for St George in a club game against Eastern Suburbs at the SCG, and he badly breaks his thumb. He is ruled out of the second test. Now, at Canterbury, Les Johns is also injured. In fact, Johns only plays a couple of games throughout the 1970 seasons. At South, Eric Sims is out of form. He's been missing easy shots at goal, and in fact, he's playing in the centres. Ray Brannigan has been playing playing fullback for South. There's talk in the media about Alan McKean, who's having a very good season at East. There's even talk about Dennis Preston, who is Langland's backup at St George. But Ray Laird gets the number 1 jersey for Australia. So, Alan, what do we know about Ray Laird?
Well, Ray Laird was the younger brother of Graeme Laird, who played for Australia in the 1950s. He was a good player, but the inclusion of Ray Laird and Brian Fitzsimmons, the hooker, this is where politics comes into play.
Okay.
Queensland selectors, usually they had 2 selectors on the Australian selection panel. They put their foot down and they said, well, Cole Weiss, he'd done the job for us as a reserve. He deserved his place, and they brought in as their replacements. And I suppose this is always the problem, that when you're bringing in players who other players don't know, they don't know how to play with them. The front row, they've got pretty much an entirely new front row there.
Yes.
Sattler's playing out of position as a front row forward. He usually plays second row for Souths, or they had played a little bit of front row. And so the combinations aren't there. And, when England came out with all guns firing, when Australian players were looking to each other, to take the lead, the combinations were failing. And it was a whitewash. It was a terrible result. It was probably 180% turnaround from the first test, where Great Britain just dominated.
Yes, because it was quite strange with Elwyn Walters, because the selectors sort of basically said that they were resting Elwyn Walters, and this is why they brought in Brian Fitzsimmons, that they intended to pick Brian Fitzsimmons for the first test, but apparently, he contracted mumps, and that's why he wasn't selected. But from all reports, Elwyn Walters had a fantastic game in that first test, and yet they were resting him for this second test match.
Well, you just go, you can't figure it out. All I can put it down to is politics, and there's been some strange selections over the years, and that's one of them.
Well, okay, as you said, the second test, Great Britain were easy winners by 28-7. And as you pointed out, Roger Millward was a big difference in this match.
Well, he scored 20 points out of the 28. He scored 2 tries and 7 goals. And he was just all over the place. And really, Australian audiences, although we'd watched a bit of club rugby league from England on television, we really didn't know who Roger Millward was. And here he was, 5'4", the artful dodger. He just mesmerised the Australian attack. And, it could have been a much worse score. They led 28-4 before we even scored a try. They had 12 men in the second half when Sid Hines got himself sent off. And it could have been a much worse result. And really, Australia were very, very disappointing, but it was hardly the same side that was played in the first test.
Well, now, okay, yes, in front of 60,962, the series is 1-1, and we go to a third and deciding test in 2 weeks' time at the Sydney Cricket Ground. Now, again, there are warm-up matches between the second and third test. The British Lions they even played a game against a Sydney Colts team, which is captained by Tommy Bishop at Endeavour Field. They won that match by 26-7. Probably the most important match warm-up game is against Newcastle in Newcastle. Now, Johnny Raper has left St George by this stage. He's now playing for West up in Newcastle. And there's a lot of talk about, maybe he might be recalled to the Test team, but the Lions thrashed Newcastle by 49-16, and any hope of Raper returning to the Test team is squashed. So
I remember that very well. In fact, Raper had been made captain of New South Wales for one game before the Test series, and they thought, is he still up to it? Raper was only 30 years old. He wasn't over the hill by any stretch of the imagination. But the standard of Newcastle football, obviously, was a long way from club rugby league in Sydney, and there was talk that they might bring him back, as the great white hope for the third Test. But no, you're absolutely right. After that match, his name had a line put through it.
You're listening to Radio League Unlimited.
So the third Test, Saturday, July 4th, 1970, the British Lions name there's only one change to their team. Mike Sidebottom comes in at fullback for Derek Edwards. The Australians make a lot of changes. The day after the second Test, okay, we go back here. The day after the second Test, Billy Smith plays for St George against Balmain and tears his rib cartilage, so he is out. John Wittenberg also damages his knee in the same match. So for Australia, Alan McKean makes his Test debut at fullback. John McDonnell shifts to the wing with Johnny King. Bob Fulton makes his Test debut with John Brass in the centres. Bob Grant from South Sydney is the new halfback. Phil Hawthorn is the 5'8", and he becomes the third captain of Australia in this series. Ron Coote returns to lock. The new second rowers are Ron Costello from Canterbury and Bob McCarthy from Souths. Arthur Beetson moves to the front row and is joined by Jim Morgan, who returns from injury, and Elwyn Walters, who was he returns as the hooker. Now, Alan, as I said Australia had three different captains in this Test series. Phil Hawthorn was captain for this match. What can you tell us about Phil Hawthorn?
Well, Phil Hawthorn had been a sensation in rugby union in the late 60s, and when he came over to rugby league, it was seen as a huge coup for the professional game. Mm-hmm. He performed very well in the first Test. Mm-hmm. His goal kicking, especially his field goal kicking, was paramount when a time when field goals were worth 2 points. In the second game, he was badly beaten to the punch by Millward, his opposite number.
Yes.
But then when they got to the third Test, it's really a case of last man standing. I interviewed Billy Smith some years ago, and Billy Smith was his halfback partner in the first 2 years, and first two Tests, And Billy Smith told me that he thought that Hawthorn would struggle as a captain because, number one, he wasn't an assertive captain. Uh-huh. Number two, he didn't know the rugby league game as better as he did. He was a lovely fellow, a really popular player, but he didn't have that aggressive need to kill, and that's what you needed in Test captains. Another couple of selection issues over this one.
Yep.
There's a lot of conjecture about who to put in as fullback, and you're absolutely right. Alan McKean was in good form for his club, but Alan McKean had played next to no rep football. He was a very capable goal kicker.
Yes.
He was a bit susceptible under the high ball, and I think the Englishman found him out a little bit, but he was really picked for his goal kicking. And the irony of this match, of course, is that he almost won it with his goal kicking, but we'll get onto that in a minute. The other big move there was the promotion of Bobby Grant, the halfback. That then nullifies the halfback combination that Smith and Hawthorn had.
Yes.
So you've got players playing alongside players from other clubs who they didn't know their combinations. And I think the other big thing that mistake they made was that they put Beetson into the front row. Now, Beetson is in the Australian team of the century as a front rower, but he was actually a second rower. He was actually a much better second rower.
Yes.
He also played a lot of prop later in his career. But by putting him in the front row, you made him vulnerable to the headbutts and the punches
yes.
and the niggling tactics
that the English, especially Cliff Watson, were going to do in this test. And they got the better of Beetson, and Beetson was sent off. And that had huge repercussions, not only for the third test, but also for Beetson's subsequent career.
Yes, because during what happened? Do you want to just tell us basically run through what happened in this third test, Great Britain versus Australia?
Well, once again, Great Britain showed their superiority. If you have a look at the team list, as you've already read out, they had 5 Leeds players in the back in the back line, and that great combination. They had centres, their wingers, their fullback. They had great combination there and great understanding of each other's games. So really, England again ran rampant. They scored tries at will. Millward and Reilly, they were setting up tries, and Australia only really kept in the match through goal kicking. And I ran into Tommy Bishop at a Men of League function, and I had a beer with him and had a chat about that Ashes series. I asked him, were you disappointed that you weren't able to play in it? And he said, no, they were a great side. Millward was fantastic. He said, but Lancashire did his best. He said to try and steal it back off the
Yes.
Englishman. And he gave penalty after penalty. So you really had an instance where Great Britain scored 5 tries to 1, and it was the 7 goals in a row from Alan Whiticker that kept us in the match. And we almost won it. And the try that Bobby McCarthy scored in this third test, and we haven't talked about Bobby McCarthy. I actually published Bobby McCarthy's biography, and Bobby told me that he had been overlooked in the first 2 tests because he was coming back from injury and he was deemed unfit. He was Australia's best forward in that game. He played really, really well. But the try that he scored was an absolute fluke. He was having a bludge in an offside position after chasing a kick, and he actually ran past the play. Coming back onside. Maybe some of your listeners can see this on YouTube. It's quite phenomenal what happens. So he's standing offside, and what happens is Australia make a little break. They throw an overhead pass. An English player touches it, and it lands right in McCarthy's hand, rolls over for the try. But he had never got onside from the previous ruck, so the try should never have been allowed. So that made the score 18-17 with about 8 minutes to go. McKean could have won the match from the sideline, but he was a toe poker, and the kicker went wide, and England, scored the winning try through Millward, and rightfully so. I think they were a phenomenal side, and they thoroughly deserved their victory.
Yes, there was a heavy penalty count in that match in Australia's favour, and as you said there was a lot of doubt about the Australian side. I mean, Arthur Beetson being sent off, apparently, well, it was quite incredible because he was penalised for 1 tackle on Sid Hines. He might have been getting square with Sid Hines for the send-off in the second test, but then, Cliff Watson said later on that he sort of had a go at Arthur about, you can have a go at Sid, but you won't have a go at me. But then, of course, what happened is the next time Cliff got the ball, Arthur Beetson just started throwing haymakers at him and he got sent off.
Well, the same thing happened in the semi-final series the previous year. The South Sydney players had niggled Arthur. They picked on him, and he had a short fuse in those days. He was a long way from being the world's best forward. That would come later in the 70s. And Beetson could be very easily put off his game. And when he was sent off at a crucial time of the Ashes series, the selectors again just put a red line right through his name, and he was overlooked for selection for Australia in the World Cup squad. And this is a World Cup squad that was decimated by injury. There were so many debutants. But, Beetson had to prove to the selectors all over again that he was worthy of the Australian Test jersey because it was felt that he'd let everybody down.
All right, so Great Britain win by 21-17. It's the last time, as you said there earlier, it was the first time that they won the Ashes since 1963, and it turns out that was the last time that they ever won a Test series in Australia. They then went on to New Zealand after Australia, and they won the 3 Tests they played against the Kiwis. But Alan, I just wanted to read you a comment that Australian coach Arthur Summers made after that first Test. After the Test match, Australia's coach Arthur Summers said that, quote, "It would be 10 years before England lost the Ashes."
Well, I think Arthur, and I've interviewed Arthur many times in my career as a writer, and he was a very good footballer, dual international. He was the captain coach of that 63-64 side that had won the Ashes. But Arthur was playing in Wagga. He wasn't even a Sydney coach. And I think Arthur was a long way off where he should have been as a coach. He wasn't the cutting edge. He didn't have the tactics. He persevered with Phil Hawthorn as coach, as captain, when he probably shouldn't have. He, picked players out of position, moved players around, and Arthur, I think, can take a little bit of responsibility for that Ashes loss. But that was an extraordinarily good Great Britain side. They only lost one match that whole tour, and
Yes.
that was the first Test. They were undefeated for all the other tours. Malcolm Reilly was such a great player that Manly bought him the next year, and he went on to win premierships with Manly. So it was a very historic side. Funnily enough, Cronulla, after losing Tommy Bishop, brought Roger Millward out for half a season to see if he could do a miracle on them, and he wasn't nearly as effective. But what happened with Australia was that the Australian selectors learnt from their mistakes. When the 1970 World Cup squad was selected at the end of the year, they chose pretty much half the South Sydney side. They realised that key combinations was pivotal when you had a very short turnaround with these matches when you're overseas. And they just chose so many South Sydney players. And they filtered it with players from this Test series that hadn't let them down. Players like Bob Fulton. He was a player of the future. Bobby McCarthy. Players who didn't have that taint of not performing under the pressure. So this Test loss, and you've got to remember, I was a 12-year-old kid when this series was being played, and we were the underdogs. We were the underdogs for the World Cup competition. We were the underdogs for the 1973 Kangaroos. It was great, considering that we've won every series in the last 30 years. It was great to be the underdogs because they underestimated us. And when the 1970 side went over there and won the World Cup, that was the impetus for us to take the advantage. Jack Gibson came into club football. We started training harder. We started, bringing a lot of science into our fitness. And the 1970 Ashes series, which was the only series in Australia played under the 4-tackle rule, that was the turning point where Australia became incredibly professional, incredibly scientific about their training approaches. And as we now know, it was England who, for the next 40 years, have not won the Ashes.
That's the way it was back in 1970. My name's Rob Corr. On behalf of Alan Whiticker, this program was produced by Tony Peterson. Until next time, may the force be with you.